2024 has been a massive year for Pixar, to tell you the truth. The last 4 years, much like for Walt Disney Animated Studios until the release of Moana 2 this year, had been rather rough for the studio overall. In 2019, Pixar released the smash hit Toy Story 4. It grossed over $1 billion, won an Oscar, and got massive critical acclaim. They were on top of the world at that time, and yet not long after, they went into a pretty massive downturn and tailspin. Onward's cinematic release was cut out halfway through due to COVID forcing cinemas to close. Then Soul, Luca, and Turning Red all had straight to Disney Plus releases. Whilst they did well with critics and probably got great viewership on streaming, the reality is that they simply wouldn't have been the return on the investment that the studio wanted. These films are costing the studio hundreds of millions of dollars to make, and so they clearly would want them all to be box office smash hits so they could keep making the big bucks and maintain their reputation as the gold standard. That didn't happen. But what also happened was a disastrous return to the cinemas once COVID restrictions were lifted and people could go back. We had Lightyear come out, and aside from being really just not all that good anyway, it also failed to generate ticket sales in any meaningful way and became a box office bomb. Why? Who knows? But I've seen a lot of speculation that people just got used to going to fire up Disney Plus to watch Pixar films during COVID, and so they didn't bother to go to watch this one at the cinema at first. No idea if that's accurate, but that's what I've read. The next year we got Elemental, which started very poorly and was also set to be a box office bomb, despite in my eyes being a really great movie, but it surged internationally and had good staying power, which allowed it to become a sleeper hit as well. Still, it was far from the glory days of the studio of the 2010s, where it felt like they were getting over $1 billion for every other film. But then the proverbial dam broke. Disney and Pixar pivoted over to sequels to get themselves out of the rut, and my god, it worked. Who would have thought? Sequels sell. And not only did Inside Out 2 sell tickets, it broke the all-time record for the biggest box office for an animated film. Not too shabby for a studio that hadn't had a smash hit for 5 years, eh? Zero to hero, real quick. But that's just the film world. Because Inside Out seems to be the gift that keeps on giving for Pixar and for fans, as only recently on Disney Plus we saw Dream Productions, an Inside Out in-between-quel release. I'll be honest though, I did expect there'd be a bit more hype and discussion surrounding the show. I watched it all in one night and I thought it was absolutely spectacular, so I fired up Reddit and all other social media in the hope there'd be people online to discuss the show with me. Not so much though. Hardly anybody took note of it except the hardcore Inside Out subreddit. Maybe that's changed in the meantime since then, but at first it was looking rather bleak, all things considered, which was odd. Hell, even Rotten Tomatoes had hardly any reviews or anything. It's wild. I suppose it is a bit of a niche concept, as the idea of a 1.5 movie is always a bit different, but I figured the connection to Inside Out, with the franchise currently being the hottest it's ever been, would do something about that. So what gives? It's such a massive shame that it's not getting as much attention and recognition, because it's honestly one of my favourite things to have released this year. It just does everything right in my eyes. But yeah, I guess that's enough of that. I've told you it deserves better, but I'd better explain why beyond vague proclamations of how it's so good. As per usual, we're going to split this up into 3 major categories: visuals, sound, narrative. All we need to judge the quality of any film or TV series can be found amongst these 3 elements. And I suppose we'd better start with visuals. Well, for starters, the actual quality of the animation's very high. I'm so used to made-for-streaming shows looking very bad. It's not a knock on them by any means, for the most part. You should know what you're getting into with these sorts of things. I very much doubt there's a massive return on investment for animated streaming shows in terms of subscriber numbers. So I get why even the big studios would sometimes skimp on the animation quality. Here though, I didn't feel that way. To the point that I did have to wonder how much did this thing cost to make? And I do have to wonder, in the end, is it going to have been worth it at all? I mean, for me, clearly it is worth it. I'm a fan. But will this drive Disney Plus subscriptions and keep people around? I'm not so sure about that. It is a treat for the fans though. And considering how much goodwill towards Disney brands I've lost over the last couple of years, every little bit helps, I suppose. Anyway, as I was saying, the animation quality was very high. Realistically, it wasn't quite as good as the actual films, because that would be rather absurd given the budget is surely orders of magnitudes different, but it still looks great. Most importantly though, I thought the actual creative design here was just off the charts. Now this is nothing new when you think about the franchise as a whole. Inside Out and Inside Out 2, at least the sections that take place in Riley's head, are truly phenomenal. This is no exception to that. You have the standard ethereal, otherworldly vibe in terms of the world and character design, but this time infused far more heavily with modern American and Hollywood aesthetics. I especially love the use of different genres of film, the settings, the shot selection, and all of that used to carve out funny sequences of various different classic genres. Horror, teen romance / 80s teen coming of age story, classic rom-com, zany 2000s rom-com with all the different boyfriends, a tragic parting like something out of a war movie or something like that. Then there's all the different animation styles that sometimes crop up, most notably for the drawing that Riley made of her ideal teenage self that was then brought to life in the world of Riley's subconscious. I really liked that visual variety, and on top of that, it was all really fluid and well done. Just great. So much better than any made-for-streaming show has any real right to be. But I suppose that's just par for the course for Pixar at this point, isn't it? Oh, and I just remembered, I loved how visually the whole thing was presented as a mockumentary. I love those sorts of stare-at/side-eye the camera jokes and whatnot. Although I do have to wonder, in the canon of this world, who's actually going to be watching this documentary? Do they have cinemas and stuff where dreams get played? TV sets for watching along? It opens up a lot of questions. Next up, we come to sound. Inside Out and Inside Out 2 are two films that have absolutely gorgeous and poignant soundtracks. So there was a lot for this show to live up to, and I think the score really did shine. It never really distracted from anything, and now that I'm a bit removed from it all, it has faded into the back of my mind, and I wouldn't be able to actually recall any of the music. But at the time, I do remember thinking that it was just enhancing things perfectly, so very well done there. But where the audio well and truly shined was in the voice acting. Of course, we have our classic characters we know from the movies, the emotions, Riley's parents and friends, yada yada yada, all of them perfect. But of course, the show wasn't centered around them. They were there and they enhanced the story and provided an anchor point of familiarity. In the end though, it was the new beings that were introduced during the course of the show that really shone the brightest. Not a single stinker in the voice cast. But the best two were by far the leads. We're talking the voices of Paula and Zenny. They really are the perfect double act here. I love the ironic contrast of their voices. Zenny has a typical dry, sarcastic and pretentious sort of voice. His performance is one that's on the surface made to be hated by all. Conversely, Paula's voice is rather kindly and sweet, major Nana vibes. And yet through layered performances and a really good script, you often find this dynamic being switched. Despite Zenny being pretentious, you root for him and you want him to succeed. You feel bad for him at times. On the other hand, Paula pisses you off and has you tearing out your hair. I suppose this leads into the actual narrative side of things. Warning, if you haven't watched it, spoilers ahead. A 4-part miniseries, Dream Productions takes a relatively small story element present in the mainline films, the idea of the little neurons, I think, working in a big film studio to produce the dreams that Riley experiences. It was a fun and clever little concept in the films, but not one I thought would ever really be explored in much depth at all. Until it was. But I'm not complaining. Dream Productions follows the life and times of Paula Persimmon, who is pretty much a parody character of a fallen titan, a big-time director from the golden age of Riley, i.e. her young childhood, who produced many classic dreams that Riley remembered fondly for years and years. However, her success with sparkles and unicorns and more childish things stunted her growth. She became stuck in her niche, and as the industry, aka Riley's tastes, continued to grow and shift, she didn't grow alongside it. She wanted her to stay the same, and so her dreams started to become less and less successful. This is the status quo at the start of the show. Very quickly, she finds herself slipping further and further down the totem pole. Her longtime assistant director gets her own opportunity to direct a dream to rave reviews, and Paula gets panned, with her office being moved to worse and worse locations, such as the studio toilets and eventually the props warehouse. With the head of the studio breathing down her neck, well, maybe not her neck, she doesn't seem to have one, breathing down her jelly bean body, Paula is forced to take on the pretentious daydream director Zenny as her co-director. Zenny seemingly is a bit out there at first, but he's able to reinvigorate her career and her creative direction. Nevertheless, she can't help herself but to try to force him out from being co-director to simply being an assistant, which causes a massive fight and a disastrous dream which gets Zenny fired and Paula on her last chance. Zenny sneaks into the writer's room to write a dream that will destroy Paula's career as revenge, and since directors are no longer allowed to have wiggle room with the scripts, it's clear that she is somewhat screwed. However, since they all love Riley, Zenny has a change of heart and they all team up to try to stop the dream going to air and prevent Riley from being traumatized by it. Eventually, the only way to stop the studio head, who's just lost the plot and thinks this is the only way, is to remove the reality filter on the camera, allowing Riley into a lucid dream where they all interact with her. And it's all wholesome and sweet and they all reconcile. Really, this show is just so good. I cannot understate this fact enough. I went into it thinking that it was going to be a collection of shorts. I didn't anticipate it was going to end up being a proper long-form narrative. It's a pleasant surprise. The script was sharp and snappy, with really great jokes, and a lot of deep-cut filmmaking and Hollywood references peppered in. To put it bluntly, Hollywood loves to talk about itself in this day and age. How many shows and films have we seen that circle-jerk the Hollywood of yesteryear and whatnot? I've always found it cringe and out of touch. Here, though, Pixar managed to include those types of themes and stories, but in a fun and unique way, without over-romanticizing or glorifying things either. Hollywood, take notes. But where the show really shined through was the character arc of Paula. You start off the show feeling massively sorry for her. After all, she's the fading star of a bygone era that can't accept that she's washed. Her ideas are bad, and she needs some fresh eyes to help her out. That pity quickly turns to annoyance at her stubbornness, and rage at her selfishness, to the point that she becomes very unlikable. While Zenny, as I said earlier, has the opposite journey. He starts off as a comedy, pretentious bully type, and quickly endears himself to the audience as he proves himself and even starts to enjoy working with Paula. After he's fired, you want to see him get revenge on Paula because he's been screwed over, only for Paula to get her own redemption alongside Zenny as she works to save Riley from the terrible dream that could destroy her sense of self-worth and confidence. Really, their joint arc carries the overwhelming bulk of the story and is what kept me invested the whole way through. Well, that and the wealth of humour coursing through the show. Then it's finished off with some really wholesome vibes with Riley coming into her own, with a look at how the dreams help her do that. I really loved how it shows us how every part of Riley's mind loves her, not just the emotions. After all, these characters are with her just as much through her dreams. I loved when they actually met her too, that whole lucid dream sequence, just beautiful. I think the best and most surprising part of all of this is how the show's so well written and how it neatly fits into the Inside Out universe. I haven't felt like a franchise's world has been so layered and deep with lore since the likes of Toy Story or Monsters, Inc. It makes me hopeful that they do continue with Inside Out and flesh out more ideas, because there just seems to be a plethora of storylines and different areas of Riley's mind to explore. A lot of care and effort was clearly put into every aspect of this show, and I cannot sing its praises enough. With all that being said though, these have just been my opinions, and now let's hear yours. What did you think of Dream Productions if you've seen it? Did you like it? Hate it? If you haven't seen it, have I convinced you to give it a try? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment and subscribe, and let me know.